project stinks. It's too big. It doesn't fit in our neighborhood. I don't want it here. I don't like the materials you're using. Get it out of here and go someplace else. Raise your hand if you've heard anything along those lines when you're trying to get a project approved. Right, that's what happens. If you're going to be doing urban infill self-storage, the situation's only going to get worse, okay? I just want to do a quick poll so I kind of understand what my audience is here. Developers, okay, contractors, okay, design professionals, okay, good. So I'm not a design professional. This presentation is going to be told from the point of view of a developer. I'm a developer. I've done a lot of urban infill, a lot of mixed use projects. I've only been in self-storage for about 4 years now. So I am one of the new guys that you veterans don't like seeing come along. But I am focused very much on urban infill self-storage. But the narration today is really going to be told from a developer's perspective. For the sake of brevity as well, you'll see the word planner, you'll see the word architect, you'll see landscape architect, urban planner. We'll talk about municipal design review board, city council. A lot of those words, we're just kind of using them as an amalgam. It's essentially we're talking about anybody who's really involved in the approval, denial of your project, controls that, has anything to say about the design of your project. So we're talking about governmental entities, we're talking about non-governmental entities, we're talking about elected officials as well. So I apologize, I know that those are all different careers to all you design professionals, but here we're just kind of talking about that in general. My goal with the topics here is to hopefully have you guys coming away a little bit with that planning community's perspective of a historical perspective of why urban development needs to take a different form than suburban development. We're going to talk a little bit about the creation of single-use zoning, what that has impacted as far as planning is concerned, what led to the change for mixed-use zoning and urban infill zoning, and how suburban sprawl fits into all this, and then basically what actions we can take as members of the development community and self-storage to hopefully improve our name as far as all of those folks are concerned. So I'm a big begin with the end in mind kind of guy. So if I can get you guys all walking out of here today and being able to confront this, which it says redesign the building so that the form, character, and scale of the building is commensurate with the residential community in the urban context. So if you were presented that challenge, can you, after you listen to everything we're saying here, are you walking away with some tools to be able to combat that? So that's really my goal for you guys today. So we're going to do a little history lesson. A lot of American planning principles started in Europe. A lot of, clearly we're a country that came mostly out of Europe, so it's not too hard to think that. But basically what happened in Europe, it grew up around the horse and buggy, and you had the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and everybody had their small shop. Along comes the Industrial Revolution, and all of a sudden these small shops are converted into very large industrial facilities. Those large industrial facilities create all sorts of bad issues, disease, pollution, poverty, and in step a group of planners and architects. And this is the advent of our planner group as our superheroes of this story. So they come in and they advocate for the separation of those uses. Well, if we've got problems with industrial effluent flowing down into our residential neighborhoods, let's separate those uses. And this is really what started a lot of what is today known as zoning. Well, the results were excellent. Life expectancy increases. City planners are now lauded as heroes. So let's move over to the United States. So we started out very well intentioned at the turn of the century. We've got two of our most synonymous cities for urban sprawl and traffic and all the things that come with that, air pollution, et cetera. Atlanta and Los Angeles. You can see these nice, beautiful, gridded streets, nice, dense urban community. We all know how that went with both of those cities. So even though we started out well-intentioned, the same thing happened over here. We started building those massive factories. We started creating all of that same industrial pollutions and all that same problem. A lot of the exact same problems that happened over in Europe happened to us. We have a creation of the tenement houses. We have insane fires. We've all heard about these old historic fires that literally wiped out entire cities. So all of this led not only to some other building codes and things like that we're going to talk about in a minute, but it really led to the demand to move out of the city and move into the suburb. So these are some original pictures of some of the original Chicago suburbs. This is actually an advertisement from that time period where you can see this is sort of being promised, and this is an industrial worker. It looks like he's a mine kind of guy. He's got a pickaxe, and it's promising that where there was all darkness, now is light. So this was the promise that was sold in America around the turn of the century for these workers, and you can't really see it, but it says right there, own a home at $10 a month. So this is really what was being sold to the population around that time. At the same time, there was a lot of government items happening. So the City Beautiful movement, which was primarily in Europe, also happened to a certain degree in the US, which ultimately became what we know as zoning. We talked about tenement housing law. So this was really the creation of a lot of today's modern building codes, National City Planning Conference. And then once we had the Depression, things started to shift a little bit more focus on the economic side of this thing. So FHA and New Deal housing, and that was really the first time we saw sort of government subsidized housing, and generally that sort of stuff needed to find, inexpensive land, but that was still on the edge of town. Well, we kind of bump around in this area for a while, but primarily, in this stage, this is still fairly limited to a select few because you needed a car to get out there, or you needed to live in an area that had rail or light rail or some sort of a transportation option, rail car, whatever it is. And so it was a fairly limited amount of areas where you really saw the suburbs grow. Additionally, cars were there, but they were not very affordable. Roads were pretty bad, so you had an affordability issue, you had an access to vehicle issue, and you had an access issue with the roads. Well, all that changes when we get to World War II. So the advent of the HUD, the advent of the FHA, the advent of the VA. You start with the Resources and Conservation Act, which then led on to the advent of the EPA. Well, HUD, FHA, VA, what do? They create very affordable housing for all of these veterans, right? And so that affordability issue we just talked about all of a sudden goes away. Now you can purchase your home, you can pay for your home. Well, we've got the next issue. We have to be able to get there. Well, you have this massive manufacturing superpower that's left over from the war. We turn those factories into factories now that are producing things like automobiles, so much so that at one point in time, 1 in every 6 employees in the country worked in some way, shape, or form in the automotive industry, which is a cool statistic I didn't even know until I was putting this together. But it speaks to what was happening at the time. So all of a sudden, everybody who could never have a car now has a car. All of a sudden, everybody who couldn't afford a home now can afford a home. Well, now we need to be able to get there. So how do we get there? Well, Federal Highway Act in '56, 41,000 miles of highways are created. So now all of these suburbs that used to be hard to get to, unaffordable, and I couldn't get there because I didn't have a vehicle, all those barriers to entry are now gone. So FHA, VA loan provide more than 11 million mortgages to those homeowners. That's pretty amazing if you think about that. So all of that added together creates this suburban boom. And with the promise of lower taxes, less traffic, convenient shopping, office parks, why do I ever need to go downtown ever again? So what happens downtown? We get abandoned buildings, we get urban decay, there's disinvestment in infrastructure. All of those facilities that need to be supported by the government can no longer be supported. So you cannot pay for police, you cannot pay for fire protection, all those issues. And so that creates a vicious cycle. So now if you were living in the city, you want to get out even more because everybody else is gone, I want to get out of here. So this happened over and over and over again and created a long-term vicious cycle throughout America. There were a few areas that were spared, but for the most part, this was a pretty common theme throughout the country. And as this happens, it creates more poverty. A vicious cycle goes on and on and on. And the suburbs keep going further and further and further and further. Well, fast forward a bunch of years, and suburbs are clogged with traffic, and you get some urban pioneering folks in the last, call it 30 to 40 years, give or take, depending on where you're living, decide, you know what, I'm going to go buy the house on the courthouse steps that's across the street from Central Park. And I'm going to fix it up, and I'm going to fix those broken windows. Well, slowly but surely that starts happening, and we have what is today sort of our urban revival. We're developers, and what does a developer do? You identify demand, and where does the demand shift? It shifts from those suburban areas into those urban cores. So we start coming in as developers and saying, well, I want to build apartments in this area because all the apartments are super old. I want to build an office building that has all sorts of different types of offices, and I want to build this. Well, what happened was all of this single-use zoning precluded the ability to do that in most urban areas. So it used to be that this use had to be there, and this use had to be there, and this use had to be there. There could be no commingling. And what ended up happening is in the vast majority of the municipal areas of the entire country, mixed-use zoning was essentially illegal. So much so that FHA loans during a pretty substantial part of, I believe, the 60s and 70s, perhaps some part of the 80s, required that all of their mortgages had to be in single-use zoning districts, which is, we're talking about a pretty substantial amount of all mortgages, right? So essentially mixed use is illegal throughout the country. Well, in step our heroes, once again, the planning group, and they say, we're going to fix this. We're going to figure this thing out. So what do they look at? They look at those historical precedents of how do we make mixed use work? What is it that we can do? Slowly but surely, cities start to get on board. They create a bunch of codes and regulations and things like that and start to educate these cities on what could work, what is sustainable, what is not. And slowly but surely, they start to adopt them. Clearly, places like New York, San Francisco, Chicago that were already had that sort of dense infrastructure and never really vacated in a lot of areas were substantially advantaged. But you got other cities that were, traditionally suburban, like Atlanta or Charlotte, started to jump on. And now we see what's going on today. So all the guys that are developing in town are changing the form of their building. Apartments look different in urban infill than they do in the suburbs. Office buildings look different in urban infill than they do in the suburbs. Why does self-storage have to change when we go to an urban infill? We have to, and that's what we're going to talk about here today. So there's a ton of buzzwords out there. These are a bunch of them. I'm not going to go too deep into this thing, but something like traditional neighborhood development, we're again talking about form here more than anything. So newer suburban developments, if you're driving down the street, you'll see predominantly garages. If you drive down a street and you see predominantly houses that are pulled up to the front of the road and you've got front stoops and the garage is set back, well, that's a traditional neighborhood. So again, we're talking about form here, not use, not anything else, but just the form that that building is take, how it's being sited on the property. Mixed use is exactly what it sounds like, a number of uses on the same site. Smart growth is essentially taking a lot of all these items, but focusing on items like environmental health, pedestrian-friendly environments, things like that. Urban infill is basically you're taking a vacant or dilapidated site and you're infilling that site, which again, this is sort of the catch-all term we're using in today's presentation. New urbanism, this is another one. This is really a set of planning principles, and this new urbanist movement just kind of started in the I guess around the 60s or so, and has morphed into essentially a lot of the national codes that have been adopted for smart growth, urban mixed use, sort of sprung out of new urbanism and has been adopted. If anybody wants some light reading after this, I would look up some new urbanist stuff because I think the way that they present it, it's very, it's dumbed down. You can get it. You can be a guy like me that's a developer and not a planning pro, and you'll understand it. Pedestrian-oriented development, exactly what it sounds like. We're focusing on the pedestrian versus the car. Most conventional development, the minute you start planning a site, the first thing you lay out is a road. On pedestrian-oriented development, you're going to put as much, if not more, focus on the pedestrian than you are on the roads and the cars. Transit-oriented development, basically creating nodes where you have multimodal buses and light rail and cars and bikes and things like that. So these are just a few of the buzzwords. We've got a bunch more here. I'm not going to really go into these. Frankly, a lot of these up here are ones that I would recommend if you ever heard these at a planning meeting, or if you were ever told to do this, I would Google them. And they're much better explained in a graphic format than they are here. But has anybody here done a conversion? Wrong. You have not done a conversion. You have done an adaptive reuse. And it was beautiful. So if you're ever in front of a planning group, you're not doing a conversion, you're doing an adaptive reuse. These are buzzwords, guys. That's all this is. So these are things that you can all wrap your head around, but definitely terms that you want to get to understand if you start working in some of these urban municipalities. So a couple here that I do want to touch on. We're going to talk about form-based code here in a little bit, which again, we're stepping away from the use and we're talking just about the form of the building. Placemaking. So if you guys have ever been to a shopping center and they took a drive aisle between two buildings and created a pergola and an outdoor cafe, they were placemaking. Placemaking can be as simple as that. It can be as simple as taking some green space on the side of your property, making a dog run. It can be as simple as putting a couple benches and some shade trees out on the front of your property. Anything that you're doing to create a place for people to congregate, to hang out. There's, again, varying degrees of this. A lot of, if you ever go to any of the retail conferences or read any of the retail work, this is a really, 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 really big theme. Malls are turning themselves inside out. They're all trying to reinvent themselves and create place. So again, this is another one that I would look further into, and it might be something that is thrown out during your meeting. Precedent. So this right here is, we're going to talk a lot about this one, precedent, because this is, frankly, one of the best best tools in your tool bag when you are working through the issues with the government. Architects, anybody here? How easy is it to justify something if there's precedent, right? It's a very, very big deal. So architects, planners, anybody in that community, if they can point to something and say, well, I'm doing it this way because it was there, well, that's precedent. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a little bit further. Vernacular, just to kind of talk a little bit about difference between vernacular and precedent. So vernacular is, so we have some people here from the Southwest, maybe. So you guys have Adobe, and you have clay tile roofs and things like that that we don't typically see in the South. So those would be vernacular to your area. So something that you would typically see, it may be as a result of environmental conditions, it may be as a result of cultural norms, but it could be anything from architectural details to the way you landscape. You guys use xeriscaping out there. So they're similar, but they are different. And so just pay attention if those two items are brought up. And again, I think with all of these, I'm just trying to give you guys familiar with them. All of these should ultimately go to your design professional and let them opine on these. So form-based codes. This, again, kind of sprung out of the New Urbanist movement. If anybody does want to look up more on this, formbasedcodes.org. It's all free. It's all free data on there, which is great because if you guys are living in a municipality and you feel like their zoning ordinances are awful and you want to help promote something that is easy to use for everybody, easy for them to administrate, push them to form-based codes because it's pretty easy. There's a whole thing that you can download called Smart Code, and it's very, 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 very simple. But essentially, form-based codes, we're talking about the actual form of the building. So we're not talking about the use. We're talking about how that building is addressing the street. We're talking about how is it creating or not, impacting or not the pedestrian or public realm. And the other advantage of form-based codes is it's very visual. You could literally hand a lot of the stuff in form-based codes to a 9th grader who doesn't know anything about city planning, and he would probably be able to tell you within a pretty accurate degree what you could do on your site. How awesome does that sound? How awesome would it be to be able to walk in to a municipality and have a very clear picture of what you could and could not do on your site without having to do all sorts of interpretation and hire some zoning attorney millions of dollars to interpret what it is. I'm not saying we're putting zoning attorneys out of work, by the way. Definitely retain a zoning attorney, but I'm just saying that from an objectivity standpoint, that's one of the biggest advantages of form-based codes. So just kind of a visual difference. This is kind of what conventional zoning is. We're talking about your use primarily, and then density. All the way on the right side here, we have form-based codes, which again, it's sort of talking about what is the mix that we want to see here. How many floors, what percentage of the site can be built, things like that. It tends to be more based on the form, less based on the use. And then kind of in between the two, we have zoning design guidelines. I'm sure some of you guys have encountered zoning design guidelines. You typically see them, some municipalities adopt them, some put them strictly in overlay districts, but they're sort of a step in between. It might have a percentage of the facade that has to have fenestration, or percentage of brick, or percentage of this. That's what you see a lot on zoning design guidelines. So the big elements on form-based code, these three are really where that objectivity is. This is really where, for our standpoint, it's really black and white. The regulating plan, the public standards, the building standards, that's the stuff that I'm saying you can hand to a ninth grader and he's going to get it. This is the part where it gets tricky. The administration. Who is ultimately administering this thing? And it's your local municipality. And that's really where the rubber meets the road on whether form-based codes, as intended, are being executed or not. So you're looking at me and saying, Jim, this sounds great, but I live in a state, there's no form-based codes. Well, you'd be surprised. This is a little old. This is about a year old. So along the bottom here, these are all the states in our country, and these are the number of municipalities in each state that have adopted either smart code or form-based code, which are similar. So this is again something you can look up online. It's free, but you would be surprised how many municipalities have actually adopted some level of smart code or form-based codes. So I would encourage you, if you are going in and you are having that first conversation with planning staff, ask them, hey, are you guys using form-based codes? If the planner doesn't fall out of his chair knowing that a self-storage developer understands what a form-based code is, and he tells you, yes, we are, or yes, we're thinking about it, you've already gotten a big advantage with your planning staff. Most of them now are familiar with smart code and form-based codes. So this is another concept within sort of smart growth, urban planning, new urbanism. This is the idea of the transect. It's really a planning tool, and the only reason I really bring it up is it gives a good visual representation, and this kind of shows you a little bit of what form-based codes kind of would show you. So along this top portion here, you can see this is sort of a side view of what the scale of that urban area is. This is middle portion is sort of a top-down view, and then you've got a visual representation here. And so what they'll do during some of these planning sessions is really sort of decide, okay, this area in here is a T6, this is a T5, this is a T4, and then they'll also start to think about that from a future growth standpoint. And generally, what you're seeing with a lot of all of the smart growth codes is they're looking for that higher density. They want to push those coals together. They want that higher density. And so if you're coming from a traditional suburban mindset of, I don't want to be looking in my neighbor's bathroom window. Well, these the majority of the urban planners, that's what they want. They want everybody really tight together. They want that density. They want to push all those coals together to make the big fire, and hopefully the fire keeps growing and growing and growing. And that's kind of what this idea of the transect does. What it also helps establish is those areas that are really important to protect, like the rural and natural zones. So again, this is just a cutout from the smart code. It's pretty clear, it's pretty objective, but it really comes down to the way this thing is implemented. Recently in Atlanta, one of the municipalities adopted a smart code, form-based code, and I was really excited to hear it, but they put this sort of catch-all at the end where You can submit, you can follow all the SMART code and everything, but ultimately they can approve or deny it based on a whim. So just, even though they're using SMART code, even though it's meant to be objective, just make sure you clearly understand the administration side, which is what we just showed. So why is it that the planning community hates urban sprawl so much? Again, I want you guys to walk away from here seeing things through the eyes of the planning community. Well, this is a summary version, but this is essentially, there's all sorts of data and reports and studies and books out to support a lot of this sort of stuff. And this is what's being taught at the planning conferences, at the college level, at the graduate level. But basically the separation of uses, it causes more traffic, right? We know that there's generally more traffic in the suburbs than there is downtown because it's mostly surface roads. There's only one way in or one way out. There's a lot of cul-de-sacs, so all the traffic has to funnel into the same roads. Well, by creating more traffic, you have to provide more roads, more public infrastructure, more money for the municipality to maintain, create additional public services because they have to drive even farther to be able to service you. Also requires substantial amounts of large vacant parking lots. The lower density, for years and years and years, the EPA pushed this mandate of lower density was better for the environment. That was reversed about 10 or 12 years ago, which also helped some of these municipalities educate their populace that, hey, higher density is actually better. If anybody wants to talk about that afterwards, I can tell you some of the studies that are there. Open space requirements. So if anybody's developed or is part of an HOA, you know that you likely have open space. Generally open space, I used to do a lot of lot development. Open space requirements was a mathematical equation done by an engineer so that you met that mathematical requirement. So your open space in the neighborhood could be a 20-foot wide swath of land that wraps over here and has some funky shape and nobody ever uses it, nobody ever goes anywhere. Well, the urban planning community wants to take those open space requirements and turn them into public parks now, right? So it's a shift in the way that they are requiring you to design things. Segregation of society by income, big political football these days. I'll leave it at that. Encourages disinvestment in urban cores. We talked again about that. And then loss of food production in agriculture areas. This is one that, it depends on where you are, but there's a big movement right now about decreasing the growth of the suburbs because all these areas that and there's this big farm to table movement, and well, how can I do farm to table if every time I turn around that farm is being sold for, I can't argue with the farmer for selling his land for $3 million, but that's where we used to buy all of our corn. So this is a big topic of discussion right now within the planning community. Counter to this, interestingly enough, is that with the rebirth of the urban revival, is the same thing, the same scenario is happening, but in opposite on industrial areas, on urban infill industrial areas. So a lot of this urban infill growth, you've got your hipsters and you've got your millennials, and they all want to go into these cool, hip, old industrial areas and turn them into loft offices and cool loft apartments and things like that. Well, they're taking traditionally industrial areas and converting them to a non-industrial use. And so there's a lot of discussion within the planning community, again, depending on what city you're in, as to how do we preserve industrial areas for industrial uses. There's a big logistics conundrum that has to be solved. And the more that these urban infill industrial areas are being converted to non-industrial uses, what do you do? And I'm not from New York, but my understanding was this latest legislation that sort of kept storage out of parts of New York had to do with not as much use, but more of the fact that industrial uses were being converted to storage, and they need it for industrial uses. And is anybody from New York that knows? Was that kind of what it has to do with? Yeah, that's what they said. Yeah, that's right. It was a justification. So what gives? We've got the planning community that basically hates us. All these things that we just talked about, the reasons they hate suburban sprawl. Why is it that they hate us so much? We don't cause any of these problems. What are we doing? What did we do wrong? Come on, guys. What's that? Well, there's definitely some economic items, but I'm thinking more just from a planning standpoint, right? So, But from a planning standpoint, we don't really cause any of those planning issues. I agree, the job and the sales tax issue is one, but I'm just trying to stick to planning principles here. So I think it's a perception issue of storage within the planning community. We are always seen as the unattractive vanilla box. We're a dead use. We talked a lot about activating pedestrian uses and placemaking and things like that. Well, you need people to do that, and we're seen as a use that doesn't have any people. And you know, it's just the ugly metal door perception. So I think that our call to arms as a self-storage development community is that we have to convince the planning community otherwise. We have to do that through education. We have to address the negative perception, and what, you know, if we look at this, it's not fact-based, it's totally emotional. So if we can overcome all of this, and we can overcome all of this, we're really ultimately talking about some emotional sorts of issues, right? Beyond the economic, which I appreciate you mentioning. That said, this has to be real. If you're going to try to educate this group of folks, it has to be real. You can't just make this stuff up. Generally, you know, feel free to argue this point, but generally your planning staff and city council, et cetera, they're typically pretty well-educated people. They've had enough presentations to know whether it's real or it's fake, or you're just sort of selling them a bag of beans. So how do we really make it real? Well, so we're getting now into kind of some of the tools that we can use as developers. So we talked about precedent. So we have architectural precedent and we have urban precedent. So essentially what we're talking about looking here is we're saying, okay, my building is here. What are all the architectural precedents around here, and is my building looking like or not looking like it fits within that? So what are the architectural precedents? And again, this is something that you can preemptively do this if you want, or if you're shot down and you're having to appeal, maybe you go back and provide this as additional fodder. You know, I encourage all of you guys, before you do submit, if you're in an urban environment like this, sit in on design review boards, sit in on city council hearings. You'll probably see the same guys from the community getting up with the same sorts of arguments. You'll probably you'll get which guy is the city council member that is a landscape architect, and that's what he cares about. So, you know, understanding who your audience is and what your audience is, I think, is an important item here. But essentially what this does is this helps us as developers justify to them objectively, not subjectively or emotionally, but objectively, that, hey, we are incorporating these architectural elements, it fits. You can't argue that it doesn't fit. So urban, again, we're talking about more of the massing, a little bit more of the use, but urbanistically, does it fit, you know? The orientation of the building, is the building, you know, pulled way back from the street? Is it pulled up to the street? Am I creating that pedestrian-friendly environment? So am I following what that urban precedent is or not? So this is a really cool one that not a lot of people use. But you know, we hear a lot on urban infill sites where you're targeting 80 to 120,000 square foot types of facilities. It's just too darn big, right? Or the newspaper puts out it's 1,000 units or it's 900 units or whatever it is. Well, you know, these big, huge numbers, because you're self-storage, all of a sudden make it look terrible. Well, what a lot of people don't understand is that in these urban areas where they've gone back and they've redone their zoning codes and their zoning ordinances, is that if you were to build these things out to what is allowable, so you can see these black lines, so you can imagine if this was my site, okay, and these were the neighboring properties. If I was able, and again, this is something you'd hire a design professional to do, but if I was able to develop, if I bought this and I developed it out at max capacity, well, look at how much bigger that is. If I bought this and developed it out at max capacity, so, and this is all I'm proposing to do, compared to all of this, guys, right? And so now you've discounted a lot of those arguments about it's too big, it doesn't fit, it doesn't this, it doesn't that. And so this is a visual counter argument that you know, you guys made the codes. You're the ones who changed the codes that allow for this, right? And I'm not even, you know, at half the size of everybody else, right? So this is a little more of the art and less of the science, but just in terms of kind of looking for and identifying sites. If you're in a transitional area, so this is sort of our transitional area. This is it after it's fully transitioned. If you could sort of find the gap, so if you sort of think of this as a smile when it's completed, right? And so you've got a really ugly smile that needs to go to the dentist here. And first they fix the teeth out here and they fix the teeth out here, but there's still sort of this gap in the middle, and they want to create this pedestrian-friendly environment, but right now it's a vacant parking lot that has barbed wire and crackheads and all those sorts of things. So if you can identify those gap sites and sell it as sort of that seamless gap filler between where you're living and where you're working, it might be an easier way to do it. That said, you probably still need to create something that's going to activate the street so that they feel like you're not just totally turning your back on what they're trying to accomplish. But these are probably good economic opportunities. You may have to sort of ride things out, but I think there's a lot of good opportunities there, and it's an easier way to sell the folks on that. So we've talked a lot about cities and old historic cities that were vacated and then were turned back into urban infill environments. But what's happening a lot lately too is the suburbs are needing to urbanize themselves. So with the whole millennial movement, I'm sure those of you who are living in cities are reading about whatever the technology company is that was in the suburban office park is relocating back into that urban office park because they want to be near apartments and all these sorts of things. So these cities that are 30 to 45 minutes outside of town are trying to figure out how do we keep this flight. Now it's just the opposite. It's a flight of employment centers, really, because those employees are looking at all of their employees have to come from this millennial base, and the millennials don't want to live out in the suburbs. They want to live in town. So how do we retain those guys? And so they are trying to now urbanize the suburbs. So this is just a sort of a typical example of imagine this is a Walmart, let's say. So how do you take something that has a pretty traditional suburban form and urbanize it? And so again, if you just think about where do we start? Well, you've already got the roads, you've already got the infrastructure, so what are we missing? We're missing the pedestrians, so you create an environment for the pedestrians, and then you continue to build out that density. So, where are the opportunities for us as self-storage? I don't really know as far as this is concerned. Maybe we are taking that back site near the detention pond that nobody wants. But again, we have to change the way that our building is laid out. So going from a suburban layout to an urban layout, what are the differences here? So this is, call it a strip center or any other type of building. This is what you would typically see in the suburbs, where you've got your curb cuts, all your parking's lined up against the front. If we're moving in town, typically what you're going to have to see, and zoning ordinances are most, urban infill zoning ordinances are going to require you to do something like that. So you've taken basically the same building, you've just moved it up closer to the right-of-way. One of the things that has to happen clearly is that setback line, which this is my old, suburban single-use zoning setback line. Well, now my urban infill zoning setback line is here. Well, that's huge. If you think about it, and you're buying this site, and this guy there's a building right here, an existing building right here, and he's built there, and he's on his setback line. Well, you've just moved your building out in front of everybody else. What does that do as far as your visibility is concerned? That's pretty freaking awesome, right? You got great signage, you got great visibility. You're going to be the biggest thing on that street, at least until those guys start to redevelop. So there's a lot of advantages to this. And really, again, all we're talking about is where are we positioning the building? Again, consult your design professional, make sure you're not creating any implications from a cost standpoint here, but this is likely what you're going to have to do with your building. The other thing is you've sort of created some sort of a streetscape that's generally going to be some sort of requirement, street trees, and you probably have something on your bottom floor elevation that at least mimics, if not is, some sort of a retail-esque type of design. Again, we're taking similar sorts of things. So this is a retail, strip center turned inside out. Parking's in the back. This is a retail big box or a self-storage big box, and it's, instead of being pushed back along the back with an ocean of parking in front, it's pushed up to the corner. My parking is along the back and the side and rear. So we're creating that active pedestrian environment. So if you think about these mixed-use opportunities, you're going to have to figure out some way to design your building so that you're pulling it out there to the street, so that when that person parks there and they get out and walk their car, even though you are a dead use, even though you are self-storage, you fit within the urban fabric of it. So scale, I don't think we talked about definition, but it's just basically the relationship between two things. Here we're really talking about the street versus the building elevation. There's kind of two magic ratios that are often used, the 1 to 2 and 1 to 3. You can't really control scale oftentimes because it has a lot to do with what your street lays out to. So if you're on a big wide street like this, can't do too much about scale. But scale really has to do with, if I'm that pedestrian, what does it feel like as I'm standing next to it? What is my, that's perceived scale. There's other ways around it where maybe you go up 2 or 3 stories and you step it back. You see that in places like Michigan Avenue, New York, where the buildings went up to a certain height and then started to step back. So you can do that in smaller suburban locations as well, that maybe everything else is 2 stories or 3 stories, but you need to go a little bit higher. You can step things back a little bit that way. So when you're thinking about your urban infill projects, these are the things that you really want to think about, and maybe ask yourself that question as you're laying out the site, again with your design professional. All this does translate into cost, right? So generally when we're talking about urban infill sites, we're going to these urban infill sites because rents are higher. So you can pay a little bit more for the land, and you can pay a little bit more on your construction than more of the suburban sites that Jamie was talking about. But always second guess, work with your contractor and design professionals, make sure that you're not over designing these things and creating a ton of cost unnecessarily. Some advantages, urban infill versus traditional suburban. We talked about that reduced setback. That increased facade can possibly, a lot of signage ordinances still address percentage of facade. And so if you have a big old facade, you can get a bigger sign. You could potentially reduce your parking requirements. And this is something, again, varies by municipality to municipality. If you are within 300 feet of a bus stop, you can have a 20% reduction in parking. Is that relevant to our use? No. But if I can reduce my parking by 20%, I'll take it. So these are the sorts of questions you want to make sure and look into and ask. Also, cross parking arrangements. If you've got a use that your parking requirement is ridiculously high for your use, they make you do 25 spaces or something for a storage facility. Perhaps you can create some sort of arrangement with the next door neighbor because your uses works with him. You see a lot of those in urban environments. Also, because it's higher density in urban infill, typically you need a lot less land to build a lot more square footage. So, yep, your land price goes up, but you need a lot less land to build substantially more square footage. And then this last one is relevant for today, certainly with the amount of development that's going on, is higher barrier to entry. So these urban infill sites can take a lot longer to gain that approval. It can be substantially more subjective in some cases, but those are all barriers to entry for the next guy to come in down the street from you. So, pop quiz: who knows how to deal with our questionnaire? Anybody got any ideas? Anyone? No one? All right. Well, clearly I failed on my job. So this was a real project. This was in the Beltline in Atlanta, which the Beltline was a bunch of urban rail corridors that are all in the urban core of Atlanta. They're all abandoned. They've been assembled by the city, and they're building big wide sidewalks for biking and skateboarding and running and jogging, and also light rail eventually. And part of what that is, they created a giant overlay district. Fortunately or unfortunately, part of that was a design review commission that really gave them carte blanche on design elements. I get the goal, and I actually appreciate the goal. I'm excited about it because what they're wanting to make sure is that any new development within certain proximity of the Beltline is pedestrian friendly, because they want to promote that pedestrian use. So what we talked about, if you're going to build a new building, don't build a big vacant parking lot in front of it, move it up to the front so that when that biker's going by, he feels better about it. So it's things like that. But this was the answer that they gave me, and this was the original presentation. I didn't think it was so bad. You know, it's a little typical. I mean, we've got EFIS. We've got these brick courses here, which creates what's called a piano nobile. It's not bad. I mean, it's not too bad. But basically, the architect was yelled out of the room, and this is what they told me to do, and I sort of walked away with my tail tucked between my legs, and then initiated the architectural precedent study and the urban precedent study that we talked about. Yeah.
I guess in response, in an adaptive reuse that we're in the middle of doing,
Yeah.
they asked us to change the facade, and then the city gave us money to do it. So,
Yeah.
I mean, they said, hey, we have money if you're willing to do it.
Yeah.
It worked out.
Yep, on an adaptive reuse, yep. So did everybody hear that? Yeah, okay. So this was, you know, just essentially kind of what we did is I went out and, I mean, this is literally as simple as you going out with a camera and you go around, you take pictures of things, looking on Google Earth. You know, I didn't pay an architect or anything to do this. I just went through and said, hey, I've got old, I've got new, and I've got stuff in between. So I sort of identified those three uses, and you know, we've got former industrial buildings that have been converted. We've got newer construction. We've got existing and active full-on industrial uses that are still industrial. So this was sort of the building typology precedent. These are some of the pictures I had. You know, this is a very condensed version of it. This was kind of a summary of what the old construction was. I did this also for the new construction as well. And so then basically with them, I came back and said, listen, guys, I've got three options here. I took to heart what you guys asked me to do. You know, my three options that I determined based on these precedents, which I presented in the precedents, my three options were, number one, attempt to mimic the look of the more traditional industrial adaptive reuse projects in the area. So talking about building a ground-up building to look like something that's been there for 100 years. Two, make a statement with a contemporary building. So, you know, do a Frank Lloyd Wright looking thing. Three, incorporate the ground-up material palette precedent, which was all of the newer, mostly apartment and retail buildings that have been there. So I went back and said, listen, I don't like this answer, and I don't think you guys do either, because this is going to result in a building that isn't honest. It's going to be an ugly copy. You guys aren't looking to build Disney World here, and neither am I. So I don't think that's the answer. Option number two, there's really no precedent for large commercial buildings. You definitely see some contemporary stuff on the Starbucks, or a few houses are very contemporary. But something this size, it's probably going to really create an eyesore, and it's not going to fit inside the architectural fabric of the community. So that really left me with this. So here, there's precedent that exists for it. There's a bunch of new construction. It's going to create an honest building, and the design is going to fit within the architectural fabric of the community. You could have heard a pin drop after that. They didn't have a single argument against it, and they were forced to approve it. So these tools work if you use them. But again, it's got to be real. It's got to be honest. And if you don't have the confidence to speak about a lot of these things, you can definitely consult your design professional. So we are done. This was the contemporary option, and that's what we actually ended up with right there. So thank you, guys.